I would bet really good money that there is not a person in any of these rooms who has not cited our next guest in their work. Nary a person has not heard of, or at least used, our guest, Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado's social dominance orientation theory and or the measure in their thinking and or in their work. And that is just one minor way in which his life and work has impacted our personal science. The field considers him the parent of experimental political psychology. His work, even beginning with his dissertation in 1977, etched the path upon which all of us who study political psychology walk. He has always treated graduate students and junior faculty like equal colleagues. He seems to remember everyone. So he'll say hello to you even when you're young and you either are or feel like a nobody. Jim remembers your face and your name, and he takes a moment and he says hello, and he chats to you about what you're working on and how you're doing, like you've known him forever. I'm sure that Jim has absolutely no idea of the impact that he's had on so many young scientists by merely saying hello to us. Sometime after college, after Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had all been murdered, Jim, like the equally great and wise James Baldwin, felt the need to escape the ignorance and the toxic white supremacy in the United States. Jim, many of you may or may not know, he moved to Sweden so that he could focus and to be himself and to do his doctoral work away from the harsh, we'll call it a limelight, of the version of racist America that existed in the late 60s and early 70s. For reasons I still do not know, but I'm really grateful for. He came back to the United States and settled on UCLA, where he carried out a big chunk of his career, and before he was lured away from the palm trees to the land of Walden Pond. Beantown called, and he answered. Professor Jim Sidanius is the John Lindsley Professor of Psychology in memory of William James and the African and African American Studies Department at Harvard University, both of those departments. I was fortunate enough to be there. I remember the talk that he gave as Harvard was recruiting him from UCLA, presenting data on bold, tough questions that few, dare I say, anyone else had the guts to ask. I was even more fortunate to have him as a floor mate on the 15th floor of William James Hall. And every time I would walk down the hall for a meeting, I would see Jim. He would always have his door open. He'd be sitting at his computer, what seemed like, from when he woke up at dawn until dusk. And when you walk by someone's office and they just stay looking down, Jim always looked up. He would always look up and it's just a little eye contact or a little smile. He always just sort of signaled that he knew you existed. Aside from his path-breaking work, I think what I love most about Jim is his commitment to his students. He doesn't follow the rules when selecting and training doctoral students and postdocs. He has this incredible ability to select students and then meet them where they are in their interests. And then he cultivates and shapes their unique talents. Some of the most innovative and thoughtful and path-breaking interdisciplinary work in our field has come from Jim's intellectual progeny. He's won all of the distinguished scientific career awards, including those from the International Society of Political Psychology, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. He was also inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007. And of course, his curriculum vitae is full of pages and pages of empirical and theoretical papers, of which we are all aware. The most wonderful thing about Jim Sidanius is that he honestly is just his true, unapologetic, fierce, empathic self. It's an honor to welcome Professor Jim Sidanius to IPSR today. Jim, thank you so much for contributing to all of our minds, to our research, to the lens through which we make sense of the world. We are so grateful to have you talk to us today. So please join me in welcoming Jim Sidanius to IPSR.
Thank you very much, Dana. That was very interesting to hear a description of oneself that I hardly recognized, but I'm grateful anyway for all the pleasant words. Anyway, to start, I consider myself a refugee from the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and 70s. And by that I mean that despite the clear and positive progress that's been made in racial oppression or uh, the diminution of racial oppression over the years, I had to come to the conclusion after thinking about it that the civil rights movement basically was a failure. And by that I mean it did not achieve what I had intended it to achieve as a participant in the Black Power and Black civil rights movement, where race is still and was still a major determinant as to what happens to one in life and the opportunities opened up for one in life. And I began to try to understand why that was. Why was um, systems of racial oppression or oppression in the United States so um, tough to get rid of? And I began to try to think from the beginning and look at and read about other revolutionary movements and what the degree to which they failed or only partially succeeded. And all of that work sort of culminated in the development of a theory called social dominance theory, which I developed in the early 1990s. And the basic observation of social dominance theory is that human social groups appear to be structured as group-based social hierarchies. Regardless of the degree of hierarchy, some societies are relatively egalitarian, or others are fiercely oppressive. But despite these differences in the social systems, the structures are quite similar in that you have one group or a small number of groups at the top of the social system and a large number of groups at the bottom of the social system. And that seems to be a human universal, since human social systems seem to be predisposed to organize themselves as group-based social hierarchies. The second assumption is that the common forms of social oppression that we're familiar with, that is to say, racism, slavery, sexism, nationalism, classism, sectarianism, and speciesism, and any number of other forms of oppression one can think of. You can think of these systems as special cases of a general tendency for humans to create, maintain, and recreate some form of group-based social hierarchy. Now, the primary goals of social dominance theory are to try to identify the multi-leveled mechanisms responsible for the creation, maintenance, and recreation of group-based social inequality. And these mechanisms are things like individual differences regarding um, SDO levels of individuals or levels of empathy, initial group-based power differences, the net effect of hierarchy enhancing versus hierarchy attenuating social institutions, and the legitimizing sociopolitical ideologies. And lastly, due to asymmetric in-group bias. Now, we posited that there are three primary types of group-based social hierarchies. One is based on age, which is relatively non-controversial. There's a distinction between adults and adolescents or children, and that's universal completely and non-controversial. The second form of group-based social hierarchy is based on gender or patriarchy, and that is despite the fact that there are some sharp differences in the degree of power differential between men and women, or the degree to which men exercise patriarchal power over women. The fact of patriarchy appears to be a human universal. But among mammals, there are some exceptions to this law of patriarchy. And there are at least 4 known exceptions. One species of bonobos, in fact, turns out to be matriarchal, in which females hold most of the political power in that culture. So that's exception number 1. Exception number 2 are found among the Moraki monkeys or spider monkeys, which are a species which is genuinely gender egalitarian. And there is no power difference between male and female Moraki, and in which the size difference between the two sexes is almost non-existent. So that's the second exception to that end. The third one are lemurs, in which females are the dominant sex, and you can genuinely speak of a gender egalitarian relationship between males and females of this species. And lastly, you have the spotted hyena, which turns out to be a matriarchal species. That is to say, that is the females who hold most of the power, especially coercive power over other females and males. But there are very few exceptions to this rule of patriarchy. The third type of group-based social hierarchy is what I call arbitrary-set social hierarchy. And an arbitrary set is a arbitrarily defined socially constructed distinction between Group A and Group B. And examples of arbitrary set hierarchies result in things like racial differences or tribe or class or religious sect or caste or nationality or clan or lineage are examples of arbitrary set hierarchy. Now, the social dominance theory has developed a sub-theory of gendered prejudice. And in this sub-theory, I make 4 arguments. The first argument is that arbitrary set discrimination must be understood as a gendered phenomena. Gendered phenomena in the sense that on average, males will display higher levels of arbitrary set aggression, xenophobia, discrimination, and social predation, and social dominance orientation than will females, everything else being equal. And this higher level of xenophobia and arbitrary set aggression is universal across all of the 5 species of great apes, of hominoids, among gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and humans. It's something we share in common. The third argument is in general that outgroup males, rather than outgroup females, will not only be the primary drivers of arbitrary set aggression, but also the primary targets of arbitrary set aggression. This has sometimes also been referred to as outgroup male target hypothesis, but we're going to call it the subordinate male target hypothesis, or Smithy. The fourth argument is that the motives for arbitrary set discrimination appear to be somewhat different for males and females. For males, while arbitrary set discrimination will be approximately driven by some combination of aggression and social dominance orientation, among females, arbitrary set discrimination will be proximately driven by fear, especially fear of sexual coercion at the hands of outgroup males. Okay, the first problem we have to confront with this way of thinking is to answer the question of why should arbitrary set discrimination vary by sex? And the deep thinking behind this has been heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's sexual selection theory and Robert Trivers' parental investment theory, which basically argues that males and females are going to differ somewhat because they're confronted with slightly different reproductive constraints, opportunities, and challenges. The obligatory reproductive investment for males generally ends with the act of fertilization. Nothing else is really demanded of most males. But the act of reproduction is substantially more costly for females and includes costs like the costs of gestation, birthing, lactation, and the non-negligible risk of death in childbirth. Because males and females inhabit slightly different reproductive environments, they will display slightly different, yet politically consequential reproductive strategies. So we can think of there being a female emphasis in the reproductive activities, which is primarily going to be oriented towards parental effort in taking care of the offspring that she has. And while the reproductive emphasis of males will be primarily devoted to mating efforts. And these differences in the emphasis of mating versus parental care have a number of interesting behavioral consequences. Among females, there will be a great emphasis on high offspring investment, relatively high mate choosiness, and preference for high status and high provisioning mates. Among males, there will be an emphasis on high social status, high social economic power, and control over resources, or orientation towards power and resource control, often resulting in male versus male competition of a lethal sort. this counterplay between male and female reproductive strategies has two major socio-political consequences. One is patriarchy, or a tendency for most of these societies to be patriarchal. We've talked about that before, which manifests itself in male political and coercive dominance over females, and arbitrary set hierarchy, which are dominance hierarchies primarily among males, and the formation of extractive male versus male coalitions. Now, if this basic reasoning is correct, it has a couple of interesting consequences. One of them is what we're going to call the invariance hypothesis. And that basically argues that levels of xenophobia on average, social predation, social dominance orientation will be greater among males than among females, all else being equal. While the level of dominance orientation will vary from society to society, the thesis argues that the difference between males and females' level of SDO, social dominance orientation, will be relatively constant across societies, or invariant. What do we mean by social dominance orientation? Well, when we've discussed this issue empirically, we define it by use of the following kinds of items, of the following kinds of orientations. Here's a selected list of 4 or 5 items used in the social dominance scale. To get ahead in life, it's sometimes necessary to step on other groups, or inferior groups should stay in their place, or superior groups should dominate inferior groups, or the obverse of that, all groups should be given an equal chance in life. And one of the most consistent findings of SDT, or social dominance theory, is the finding that males seem to have higher levels of SDO than do females. And one of the most impressive empirical demonstrations of this is done by a meta-analysis of Lee, Prado, and Johnson, who looked at 101 samples using 28,353 respondents across 16 countries, and found there was not a single instance where the average level of SDO was higher among females than among males. Some of the differences were not significant at all, but never was it the case that females had higher levels than males did. Hypothesis number 2, the subordinate male target hypothesis. If we define ASD, or arbitrary set discrimination, as the discrimination one suffers by virtue of being a member of a given arbitrary set category, then this thesis argues that the average level of arbitrary set discrimination among outgroup males will be greater than the average level of arbitrary set discrimination suffered by females, which might or might not be significantly different from 0. Now, if you think about this thesis or hypothesis for a minute, it seems to counteract or contradict one of the most popular ways of thinking about multiple social identities, negative or socialized identities which are stigmatized, and that is the double jeopardy hypothesis. If you assume that females are at a disadvantage in most societies because they suffer from patriarchy, and African American females, for example, suffer also from racism. Therefore, if you are an African American female, you're going to be doubly handicapped or doubly stigmatized. And this thesis of the subordinate male target hypothesis argues that that's not, in fact, the case, that you will not be doubly stigmatized or handicapped for having multiple stigmatized identities. Now, what is the nature of the evidence supporting Smithy? Well, there are mounds of it, which we don't have time to go through in this short presentation today, but they can be grouped into three categories. There's a good deal of survey evidence, which shows support for Smithy, archival evidence, and experimental evidence, both field experimental evidence and laboratory experimental evidence. And I'm going to go through some archival evidence and some experimental evidence for the rest of this talk. Archival evidence. The first bit of archival evidence we're going to look at are hate crimes and the dynamics of hate crimes. It turns out that, not surprisingly, most hate crimes are perpetrated by males rather than females, and they're directed towards males rather than females. So that, according to the Bureau of Justice statistics, between 2000 and 2003, 90% of the hate crimes were attacks of male perpetrators against male victims or male targets. It's very much a male on male phenomenon. Well, hate crimes against gays shows a similar pattern. And it turns out that the hate crimes against gay men, 86.2% of those hate crimes are perpetrated by males or are targeted against males, and 13.70% are targeted against gay females. What about employment data? More archival evidence. If these are median income data in 2008 by sex and race, and what we see here are the median income for white males, which is substantially larger than the median income for black males. But if you look at the difference between white and black females, that difference is really almost non-existent. That there is no major difference in the income level of white and black females. Now, these data control for nothing. They don't control for level of education or the type of job involved or anything else. So we're going to look at data like this, except where there are more controls. And one of the most impressive data sets dealing with this issue was a study done by Farley and Allen in 1987. And what they looked at was the value of one additional year of education, advanced education, for one's hourly wage in 1960 and in 1980. So this first set of bars show that in 1960, black men earned substantially less money per hour than did white men. And in 1980, a generation later, everybody was getting paid a little more, but the pattern, the difference between black and white men was about the same. Or white males were, were awarded substantially higher wages per hour, dollars per hour, than were black men. Looking at women, we see a very interesting pattern. In 1960, there is no evidence that black women get a higher return on investment, educational investment, than do white women. And white women don't get any higher than black women. If anything, there's a slight tendency for the hourly wage to be slightly higher among black women than among white women. A generation later, we find an even more stark trend in that direction. There is no standard difference between white and black women in return on educational investment. If anything, black women get a slightly higher return on educational investment than do white women. We use data from the 2010 census to follow up on that pattern, and the same basic set of results was found there also. That is to say, there are substantial differences in the rate of educational return for black and white men, but these differences are really quite minor for white and black women. I'll skip this because we're running out of time. This is a study by the economist Raj Chetty looking at wealth transfer for across generations for white and black male and females. So on the y-axis, you have the average child household income in percentiles. And in the x-axis, the parental household income in percentiles for parents. And if we just restrict our attention for a minute to white males, we see that there is a relatively high level of transfer from parents to children among white males. And the income level of white males is higher than for black males. And these are sort of data which are consistent with a lot of other familiar with. Turning to females, we find a very different pattern. While females, children, both both black and white, get less transfer of parental wealth to them, there is no racial difference in the rate of return or parental transfer for white and black females. If anything, females enjoy a slightly higher transfer rate, wealth transfer rate, than do white females. But nowhere in this graph is there any evidence of racial disparity between white and black females. And it turns out that the economic difference between whites and blacks that we're all familiar with is really attributable to the difference among males and is not being driven by the difference between white and black females. What about the criminal justice system? Not surprisingly, if we look at incarceration rates per 100,000 by gender and race, that women are incarcerated at substantially lower levels than are men. But the difference between females and incarceration rate within each ethnicity are less dramatic than the differences are among males. So for instance, if we look at the ratio of incarceration rate between white and black, women, we see that black women are incarcerated at almost 3 times the level that white women are. And that's no surprise. And Latino women show the same difference in their relationship to white women. Latino women are imprisoned and incarcerated at 1.64 times the rate that white women are. So those are the differences between whites and blacks for each gender among women. But the difference is the same kind of difference among males is much more dramatic. If we compare white and black males, we see that black males are incarcerated at almost 7 times the rate that white men are incarcerated. And among Latinos, that rate is also to the disadvantage of Latinos. Latino males are incarcerated at almost 3 times the rate that white males are. What about experimental results? The most interesting experimental finding of recent years was in the shoot and don't shoot paradigm of Ashby Plant and her collaborators. And she looked at the tendency for subjects to shoot at a computerized figure, ambiguous white or black, male or female figure with an ambiguous object in their hands. And people can make two kinds of errors in this kind of experimental scenario. One of them is in shooting an unarmed suspect. So those are found in the white bars. These are the level of errors made in various combinations of gender and sex for error number 1. The second type of error you can make is in not shooting an armed suspect. And so what we see here is that if we compare the white bars from black males, white males, black females, and white females, black males are substantially more likely to be shot in this shoot-no-shoot scenario than is anybody else. But that seems to just be restricted to males, because if you compare females, you find out that black females are not shot if they're unarmed at a significantly higher level than are white females. That error rate is about the same. And it's no higher than the error rate for white males. So the chances of shooting an unarmed suspect are really more or less the same for white males, black males, and white females. The exception here is the tendency to shoot unarmed black males experimentally. And the second type of error is in not shooting an armed suspect. And the error rate for black males is very low here. Black males, again, if they are armed, are very likely to get shot, and much more likely to get shot are equivalently situated white males. But the people who are least likely, the armed suspects least likely to get shot are white females. What about experimental data and employment discrimination? The best way to look at that is by the use of employment audit studies. An audit study or a correspondence study is a study in which people seek a job with the same credentials, the same age, the same job, the same level of savings in their bank accounts, where everything else is corresponding to one another. And we simply see whether or not you're offered the job if you're black compared to if you're white, or if you're Asian compared to if you're Latino or whatever. And we looked at 19 such correspondence studies or employment audits in Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, the USA, and Canada, and looked at 3 types of employment audit studies. One type in which we use the correspondence procedure, where you simply write a letter saying, "My name is John Johnson. I graduated from Berkeley and with a GPA of such and such, and I'd like to get a job." Or you can apply for a job by use of telephone or in-person job application. And what the data show is that despite, regardless of the comparison we make between ethnic groups, that whites, for instance, in comparison to West Indians, comparison to East Indians, native white versus Greek immigrants, white versus blacks in the US, or Germans versus Turks, Dutch versus Surinamese, Dutch versus Moroccans. In each and every case of comparison between minorities and dominance, the minorities are much more likely to get a job offer. Minorities are much less likely to get a job offer than our majority group members. Regardless of the technique used, whether it's a correspondence audit by mail or a telephone audit or an in-person audit. And what we decided to do was break down the jobs by the type of job it was, the amount of training needed, whether the job was meeting the public or not, to see whether or not controlling for these differences showed any difference in the likelihood of being discriminated against if you were a male or a female. And we found no differences if you didn't control for any characteristics of the job itself. But if you control for the type of job, the job experience, whether it was meeting the public or not, what you find is that males are much less likely to get a job offer than equivalently situated females. A more recent example of this was a test, an audit study done in Sweden, looking at Arab names as a function to see whether or not Arab names functioned to increase the discrimination that one suffered depending upon the gender. So for instance, here they looked at females, Arabs versus Swedish subjects. So if there's no discrimination between between job likelihood, then you're likely to get a ratio of 1. And what these data show is that for women, Swedish women were twice as likely to get a call back in the job seeking situation as Arab females were. And the same thing worked for men, that men were about 2 times as likely to get a call back than males were. And there doesn't seem to be any difference in the level of discrimination between females and males. But what these researchers did was to see what would happen, what kinds of characteristics the job applicant would need to have in order to have the same chance as a Swede to get the job. So what they did was give the Arab-sounding names enhanced CVs, or curricula vitae, of 2 years more of job-related experience in the profession than the native Swedes had. So and what they found was that if you looked at a overqualified Arab female, they had about an equal chance of being hired for the job as a Swedish female. There was no level of significant job discrimination. But among males, if anything, it was the overqualified or highly qualified Arab job seekers who suffered an even higher level of job discrimination compared to his Swedish counterpart. Experimental evidence. It's called the prepared fear paradigm. And this basically says that there are 2 kinds of critters in the world. One's critters that we're unprepared to be afraid of, like ducks and butterflies, or critters that we are prepared to be afraid of, like poisonous snakes and venomous spiders. And what the researchers Ullman and Mahinka did was look at whether or not you could get rid of fear of conditioned stimuli if you stopped reinforcing the level of a fearful association that the subjects had. So for instance, here these ducks in the unprepared category of ducks and butterflies, you could get people to be afraid of ducks, even though you're not prepared to be afraid of them, by pairing every time you see a picture of a duck, you get an electric shock and are exposed to white noise. And so in a classical conditioning situation, you can begin to differentiate the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, so that after you no longer are reinforcing the stimulus with white noise and electric shock, the difference in the fear level is going to go down, going to be about equal. You'll be just as afraid of the conditioned stimulus, the formally conditioned stimulus of a duck as you would be of a butterfly. But with prepared stimuli, once you condition people to be afraid of one exemplar of a prepared stimulus, the fear of that stimulus never quite goes away. So Olson, Ebert, and Banaji did an experiment where they saw if that could apply to human groups. And you can look at ethnicity as something that one is either prepared to be afraid of or not prepared to be afraid of. If you are a white subject, you're not prepared to be afraid of white stimuli or other whites in your same category. So these both from the beginning are unprepared stimuli. But if you're white, you are prepared to be afraid of people or members of outgroups. And if you associate both prepared and unprepared stimuli with white noise and electric shock, you can get this individual here, for example, to be afraid of, to be fearful more so than this individual who is not being shocked or exposed to white noise. And the difference in the response, the fear response will be different, will be the same between these two, regardless of whether or not you shock them or not. But that's not the case with members of outgroups, that even once you stopped shocking a member of a prepared group, the fear of that individual never quite went away. So for whites who are prepared to be afraid of blacks, it's easier to condition them to be afraid of blacks as a target, and much more difficult for that fear to dissipate. And the DV in this experiment was a skin conductance response, or SCR. And what Olson and his collaborators did not do, however, even then they found a race effect, that you are the fear of outgroups is much more difficult to erase than fear of in-groups. They didn't look at it as a function of gender differences or gender of the target, as social dominance theory would have done, and we decided to look at. And what we got was the following, that for female targets, their extinction response, once you no longer reinforced the conditioned stimulus with electric shock or white noise, there was no difference in the extinction response for in-group females or for out-group females. There was just no response that showed fear among either one of those out-group females. But among males, we get a very different pattern, that once the conditioning of the male targets were no longer being reinforced, we found out that the fear of the in-group member, male member, went towards 0, basically. But the fear of the outgroup member never dissipated. There was resistance to extinction in this situation. Dana?
Yes, please. No, you have time. If we don't end until 1:30 and there's time for chat. So if you want to present more data, please do.
Okay, I'll take one more data point.
Great.
This is in what I call the Vladimir's choice paradigm. And Vladimir was a dirt poor Russian peasant who had 15 kids, and they were basically all starving. And one day God came down from his heavens and said to Vladimir, Vladimir, I'll grant you any choice. You can have your choice of anything you want. I'll grant any of your wishes. And Vladimir said, any wish? And then God said, yes, any wish will be granted to you if you want to. There's only one catch. Anything I grant to you, I'll give your neighbor Nikolai down the road twice as much as you get. Twice as much as I get. Yes, twice as much as you get. And so Vladimir thought about this for a while, and he eventually came back to God and said, okay, God, I want you to take out one of my eyes. All right. And that's a choice in which the people are willing to punish an outgroup member, even at the cost of a high level of cost to the in-group. And we decided to try to simulate that kind of Vladimir's choice in a study of increases in yearly assessment for student organizations. So the paradigm went that University of California is suffering from a budget shortfall, and we're going to have to charge each of these student organizations more money in order to keep going. And we can have several different combinations of where the money is to be taken from. And if you are a white male subject, the organizations can be either white male organizations predominantly, or white or minority male organizations. So in principle, you can make two kinds of choices. You can decide to go to the right and have the combination of $7,000 fine for the in-group, but $1,000 fine for the out-group. Or you can charge $19,000 for the in-group and $25,000 for the out-group. And the in-group, the only rational choice to make is to choose this combination closest to the end here, scored -6. Here you only suffer a $7,000 fine. But the problem with this is that members of outgroups are going to pay even less than you do. And that's one option and various combinations of that option. Or you can find each group, both in-group and out-group, male and female group, the same money, $13,000 a piece, or you can go to the opposite extreme and pay $19,000 from your group and $25,000 from the outgroup. And the problem here is that you can spitefully allocate this fine to the outgroup at a cost of $19,000. So the question is, this kind of spiteful allocation, under which circumstances is it most likely to occur? Depending upon the sex of the perpetrator or the respondent and the sex of the target. If we look at female targets for a minute and male and female respondents, you see that the y-axis here is 0, which is tending towards the rational response. That is to say, everybody paying less money, even if the outgroup pays less money than you do, but you get a lower fine. That's the optional response and the more economically defensible response. And it turns out that regardless of the gender of the allocator, if the target was female, you are less likely to get a spitefully punitive response. And for male targets, it was the same pattern. If it's a female respondent and a male target, they're also not likely to get a punitive response. The only combination in which you get a punitive response, a spitefully punitive response, a Vladimir's choice, if you will, is when the target is male and the respondent is male. It's this column right here. So conclusions. We're arguing that arbitrary-set prejudice and discrimination are largely a gendered phenomena. That means that compared to females, males are more likely to exhibit xenophobic, socially predatory, and anti-egalitarian behavior, everything else being equal. And consistent with the male target hypothesis of Smithy, males are not only more likely to be the instigators or the executors of dominance tingent social predation, but also more likely to be the targets of such predation. And finally, since group-based social dominance and social hierarchy and social predation are the default states of the human condition, the achievement of genuinely democratic and egalitarian human interactions at scale will be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve and to maintain. And I think I'll stop it there and take questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Derek, I think you have a number of questions in the chat. Some people are going to ask them directly, I think, and others you're going to ask for them.
Yes, I'm gonna elevate Regina, a first-year PhD student in social psych, to ask one of her questions. Regina.
Also, Derek, watch the hand raising. It looks like a few people have raised hands as well. So.
Okay, Regina, can you speak? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I have a couple questions, but I guess since there's so many, I'll ask one of them. So in terms of experience discrimination by minority males versus minority females, is it that we're looking at different dimensions? Because I think there are certain dimensions where the discrimination is higher for minority women. So for example, with Black and Indigenous women, there are higher rates of them going missing than their male counterparts, and also when compared to white women. And also they're 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than their white counterparts, and experience many other health-related disparities. So my, I guess to like wrap that up, it's just like, well, while maybe Black and Indigenous men may be facing more visible forms of discrimination, Black and Indigenous women are facing less visible or more invisible forms of discrimination.
Okay, there are two parts to that answer that I'm going to give. The first one is that you sort of alluded to is whether Black women experience large, high levels of discrimination, whether the lived experience was substantially different for them compared to their white female compatriots. And the answer to that is that minority women do feel like they're being discriminated against more so than white women are. That's absolutely correct. But when you look across various domains, whether it be the criminal justice system or the healthcare system or the educational system or just walking down the street, it turns out that you're much more likely to be targeted if you are a subordinate male than if you're a subordinate female. What Black women experience as being racial discrimination, I'm going to argue, is really gender discrimination. That females, both white and Black, suffer from patriarchy. And that patriarchy is basically the same, as far as we can tell, in any experiment was ever done. But their actual level of discrimination in terms of payment at the job, or likelihood to get fired, or likelihood to get beaten up or shot by the police, is really a gendered phenomena, gendered in the interaction. That the most dangerous combination is subordinate male target. That's what the data seem to imply. Was that an answer to your question?
Kind of. I guess I'm still not able to reconcile it with the examples that I've given about like the rates of going missing and so I guess you could say that men will not, for the most part, most men will not experience, pregnancy-related deaths. But even when you're looking at the category of pregnancy-related death with Black women and white women, it's a disproportionate rate. So yeah, it's just, I don't know, a different way to say that, but I'm not sure if you're answering that particular aspect of my question.
Well, I'm going to suggest that what we often experience or think as double jeopardy turns out not, in fact, to be double jeopardy. That there is sexism that both white and Black females experience at about the same level. But Black females don't experience this extra bonus of being discriminated against in this double sense, is what the data shows and is consistent with theory. Other questions?
Yeah, Jason Akonakura has his hand raised. I'm going to allow him to speak.
Hello, Jason.
Hey, good afternoon. Just really quickly shout out. Great to finally see you. I've seen you in pictures by Malik back when he was here. at Berkeley. I've been hearing about you since Jen Richardson taught me your work when I was 19. Very honored to speak with you. I was just going to throw in there on Regina's point. So I do work along punitiveness, like arrests, incarceration, the extent to which we exclude children from schools. And some more recent research on intersectionality finds that, for example, both in school discipline and in criminal justice, Black boys, Black men, well, I should just say Black males, period, are more likely to receive that punitive response than in like all the other social categories combined. And yet, when we look specifically at females, the Black and Latina females are indeed significantly more likely to be incarcerated or suspended from school, and that's increasing over time, which kind of implies that that may not have been the case as much before, but is growing more and more in recent years. I just want to throw that out there and get any thoughts you might have about A, how or why something like that might be changing over time, but then B, where do we place that as it pertains to these effects being due to fear, a fear response?
Okay. My response to that is that, well, let's take the last part of your question first. Recent data shows that the level of fear is just as justified for males, regardless of whether they are, well, let's see. The data don't show that this double handicap phenomena. That should be the case when we know that males are discriminated against to a high degree compared to females, and that what females are experiencing is really the effects of patriarchy. And up-to-date evidence, more recent evidence, basically shows the same pattern, which is why I like this shoot, don't shoot paradigm so much, is we're able to really tease apart the effects of each one of these factors and the overall level of the DV.
I appreciate that. And I don't think as a quick follow-up, I don't necessarily think that the things that each of us are saying are not could not both be true, in the sense that it could be patriarchy that's leading to males being more likely to be targeted than women, specifically as it pertains to like punitiveness, things like that, I would say, or punitiveness like getting locked up or suspensions. But the fact that still there's, and it's smaller, in this, well, in some cases larger, that Black, Latina, American Indian, Native American women are indeed incarcerated significantly more than white or Far East Asian women. That does exist. And so it just kind of opens the possibility that indeed that patriarchy would be there, but then there may also be something else. But then also I keep going back to the punitiveness, similar to your shooter bias paradigm. And I think something that Regina was getting at, I think can be more apparent if we talk about sexual violence, in which like the patriarchy is turned on its head. And it's like, now the targets are not the Black men or the males, but indeed the targets of that aggression, that potentially fear, that phobia, that violence seems to be disproportionately directed towards those women of color.
You know, one point that I don't think I emphasized enough in the presentation was the fact that both levels of arbitrary-set discrimination and patriarchy can be operative in any given case. What we're arguing, however, is that the effect size of arbitrary set discrimination is generally larger than the effect size of gender discrimination.
I'm not familiar with the work myself. I'll take your word with it, but thank you for bearing with me in that question. I do want to allow our students to have more time to ask questions. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right.
I wanna just say quickly, so it is 1:29. If anyone needs to go, Jim, do you have a few extra minutes? There's so much
Yeah, I can hang
conversation.
on.
Okay, that would be fabulous. So if anyone needs to go, please feel free. And thank you, Jim, for coming and spending your precious time with us. For anyone who'd like to stay and continue the conversation, anytime Jim presents this work, it always, evokes a lot of emotion and a lot of conversation, because he's making a really provocative point that the data suggests something that is inconsistent with our intuitions. And so we can continue the conversation for a little while longer because Jim has so graciously agreed to stay. But for those of you that need to leave, please, and thank you so much, Jim, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. So let's continue the conversation as long as you have time, Jim.
No problem.
Yeah, Art Aaron has had his hand raised for a while. I'm going to elevate him.
There we go. Hi. That's really important work, Jim. Really creates a lot of thinking. A couple questions. The most important one is, could this apply to any two outgroups? In other words, could there be kind of a floor or a ceiling effect, independent of gender? So if you're already prejudiced, say, by race, would nationality add less to it? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. And I think the answer to that question is we don't quite know. And we don't also quite know what the limits of arbitrary set discrimination are. We argue that any socially constructed distinction between one group and another is by definition an arbitrary set distinction. And it's arbitrary set distinctions which will be more consequential for outgroup males than for outgroup females. But we don't know what the limits of that are, what the boundaries of that are. Does it work for the criminal justice system? The data seem to indicate that yes, it does. Does it work for the educational system? It seems to work there also.
Yeah.
Are you guys still with me?
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering if two different outgroups having nothing to do with gender, like if we're dealing with all males in two different outgroups, would we see the same kind of effect, where if they're both, it doesn't add as much?
I understand. And the answer to that would be no. We think that gender as a dimension of oppression is unique. It's not and different from arbitrary set, which is why we make the difference between them. Arbitrary set discrimination can be extremely brutal and genocidal, whereas violence against women, while oppressive and violent, is rarely genocidal. It's not the case that you decide, well, one day we're going to get together with my other buddies in our group and kill all the women. That doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen often, if it does at all happen. But that's not the case with arbitrary set discrimination. People can get together and decide to wipe out all the men in Group A. That these are two qualitatively different kinds of distinctions, and one can't be reduced to the other. But it's possible that if you had multiple arbitrary sets, there would be some hierarchy of importance as to which of those arbitrary sets was most important. And there is no a priori theory that I'm aware of which would lead us to believe that one arbitrary set would take precedence over another. It depends on what's relevant in a particular situation at a particular time.
Thank you.
I'm going to allow Bob Levinson 1 second. Here we go.
Thanks, and thanks for the talk. It's great to hear. It's been a while since I've heard you speak, and it's really an honor to have you. I wanted to ask you if you're willing, having lived in the segregated South in the 1960s and during the time when racism was really very explicit, not implicit, writ large, and all of the social structures, there's a familiarity to this period we're living in now of white grievance and xenophobia and white extremism, and a much more public presentation on the part of some people of what had become more of a quieter and more implicit kind of expression of racial bias. And I was wondering, from your vantage point, did you expect this sort of outpouring of white privilege and white grievance? Is there anything in this that has surprised you? And is there any way to sort of turn this around and make it a positive as we move forward?
Well, I didn't expect, I did expect there to be a continuation of racial oppression in the United States, because systems of oppression rarely go away. They mutate, they ebb and flow back in terms of the degree of ferocity of the oppression, but rarely do they disappear, which is, I guess, is one major theme of my thinking about this, is that the degree of oppression and severity of oppression can ebb and flow, but the fact of a given set of oppressive features, or the fact of oppression, is rarely, it does not go away. What we don't know is, with any certainty, is what are the circumstances, understanding what the circumstances are, which contribute to this ebb and flow, this increase and decrease. Part of it is fear that dominant groups have of being displaced by the other, by the subordinate other. So a lot of the Trump's attitude towards minorities and the kind of response he's gotten from Euro-Americans in the United States is a response to perceived threat, not so much of concrete goods, but of relative status and power and prestige, which is very threatening to people, more so even than competition over material goods, but a threat of being displaced as the dominant group, the dominant arbitrary set, can be extremely lethal. And we're seeing that play out in contemporary American politics.
Thanks.
Jim, we had a question from Camilla, who is asking how this relates to discrimination that we know about that happens toward the queer community and trans folks. In terms of the theory, how does that play out?
That's a good question. I struggled with this for a long time, is to try to understand whether queer categoriness was simply an arbitrary set, a gendered category with everything that implies, or something altogether not fitting in the way we were conceptualizing this. And by looking at the kinds of violence directed towards queer people, I'd have to say that it behaves more like an arbitrary set than anything else.
But as a follow-up, Camille said that Black transgender females specifically have way higher rates of experiencing hate crimes, being murdered due to their intersectional stigmatized identity.
Mm-hmm. And the question is it just intersectionality that's at play, or is their existence as a arbitrary set group what's driving it? That's not clear to me yet. So I'm not coming out with a hard position one way or another, but just a question that we have to try to understand how queerness is being parsed by dominant groups.
Camille, I just elevated you, so you should be able to speak. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks so much for this talk. Yeah, I guess I'm just, I didn't really word my question very well because I was typing really fast, but I guess I'm wondering if, we're not looking at gender as an arbitrary set hierarchy in a basis of which people discriminate against one another, then how would we, how do you explain, anti-trans bias and discrimination and hate crimes against trans folks if we're not looking as gender as a arbitrary set of, and as an arbitrary norm against which people can discriminate against one another?
Well, some people like to think of prejudice and discrimination as simple against women as the same animal as discrimination against Muslims or blacks or whatever. And my pretty strong position on that is that there are some peculiarities or particularities to gendered categories compared to arbitrary set categories. I could go through them if you want, but they're not the same thing. So racial prejudice, for instance, is not simply prejudice, racial prejudice or prejudice against, well, let's put it this way, that gendered prejudice is not simply prejudice against people with different genitalia or different values, that it's a different phenomena altogether, that the relationship between men and women is not like the relationship between arbitrary sets between whites and blacks. They have different dynamics and have to be understood in their own terms. So sexism is not simply a form of racism against women. It's got its own dynamic.
Definitely, yeah, that makes sense. I think that answers, again, part of my question, but I think I'm just confused in how we define gender and how we define arbitrary versus non-arbitrary forms of status and identity. But I see where you're coming from, and it makes sense. Thank you.
And well, I think, to follow up on that for a bit, we have argued for a long time that whereas arbitrary set discrimination is totally socially constructed differences between groups and between people, gender differences are not just socially constructed, that there are some essential differences between men and women that contribute to a different dynamic, a different political dynamic, that we have to think of gender as a distinctly unique kind of social identity.
I see, thank you.
Okay.
And Dana and a few others had a question kind of further probing the double jeopardy hypothesis, or the phenomenon, or lack thereof, according to the evidence you presented. The question
When do
was,
we can
yeah.
when do we let Oz? Oz had kind of
Oh,
a
yeah, I
nice.
was okay.
Is she still here? She might have popped off.
I'm not still here.
Okay. There were two people. They kind of Oliver did too. Oliver, yeah, Oliver's still here. Why don't we, Oliver, we'd love to hear from you, Oliver. Oliver was telling us that you came, Jim, a few years, I guess maybe 20 years ago to IPSR and spent some quality time with us. And so Oliver was reminding us of our longstanding relationship with you. So Oliver, do you want to elaborate on the this sort of double jeopardy effect question that the three of us kind of were thinking about?
Yeah, Oliver, can you show your video?
I don't know. So I think that somebody has to do something.
I elevated you to, you should be able to, let's see.
He's here.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's
Oh,
here.
there he is. There we are.
All right.
Hello, Oliver.
So it's just wonderful to see. I was just remembering back is but 20 years ago, in the early 90s, Felicia Prado was a postdoc with us here at IPSR, and there was this really memorable visit where you were laying out the beginnings of your work. So it was just a really wonderful memory, and great to see that you pushed it this far. On the intersectionality hypothesis, I really was just so happy to finally see some systematic evidence, because I have a 14-year-old who comes home and pronounces that intersectionality, carries through all of these domains. And I always say, well, what's the evidence, right? And so it's interesting to see that things are more complicated, right? Because what felt so true may not be quite as simple, as it is. And so thank you for walking us through these studies.
All right, well, thank you, Oliver.
Well, I don't want to take so much of your time, Jim. You've already generously given us an extra 16 minutes, which I'm sure we enjoyed every moment of it. Is there any final thing that you'd love to say to our audience before we let you go so that you can get on with your day?
No, not really. I mean, I enjoy talking to you, and I've been struggling with these issues for years, and I feel like I'm making a little progress, but there's still a whole lot of more understanding that's got to go into the nature of these complex issues. And you guys have been very helpful that way.